It was May of 1453, and the city still glimmered like a fading jewel upon the edge of the sea. The dawn over Constantinople came soft and golden, the kind of light that made marble glow and domes appear almost weightless. Bells rang from distant towers. Priests in long robes crossed the courtyards of Hagia Sophia, whispering morning prayers that rose like smoke into the pale air. And yet, beneath that beauty, there was a silence, a deep, listening silence that seemed to know what was coming. The people felt it in their bones. For weeks, the ground had trembled with the thunder of Ottoman cannons. The Bosphorus, once calm, had turned into a path of warships and smoke. Still, life clung to its rituals. Bakers lit their ovens, soldiers sharpened their swords, mothers washed their children's faces. They moved through a city that had stood for over 1,000 years, pretending, if only for a few hours, that it might stand for 1,000 more. High above the city, in the palace of Blachernai, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos stood before an open window. He watched the sun rise over the water, the same sunrise his ancestors had seen when this place was called Nova Roma, the New Rome. He was not a man of great armies or fortune. He was instead the last caretaker of a dying dream, the Roman Empire that had outlived its own myth. His armor was worn, his crown simple, but his gaze was steady, fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. He had no illusions left. He knew that behind that horizon, the young Sultan Mehmed was waiting with cannons large enough to break mountains. But Constantine believed that some things were worth dying for. Not for glory, not for empire, but for the idea that light could still defy darkness, if only for one more day. The city stirred beneath him. From the great walls to the narrow alleys, people moved like shadows, praying, working, preparing. The smell of salt and smoke drifted together. Somewhere a child laughed, then fell silent. The sound lingered in the air, fragile like the empire itself. As the first rays of sunlight struck the domes of Hagia Sophia, the gold mosaics within shimmered as though alive. The ancient church, born from Justinian's vision nearly 1,000 years before, still held the breath of an empire. Its vast interior echoed with hymns carried by trembling voices. They sang not in triumph, but in surrender to the inevitable, a plea that heaven might remember them when the earth forgot. Outside the walls, the drums of war began again. Constantine closed his eyes for a moment. Then he turned to his guards and said softly, "Let the gates remain closed. We will meet them here, where Rome began and where it ends." The sun rose higher, gilding the city one last time. From the harbor to the hilltops, Constantinople gleamed like a dying star, beautiful and doomed. And far beyond the walls, the Ottoman army began to move. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind carried the salt of the sea through the broken windows of the Blachernai palace, Emperor Constantine XI of Palaiologos sat alone beside a flickering candle. The wax had melted into uneven ridges, dripping down the bronze stand like the slow passage of time itself. Every sound was magnified in that silence. The groan of timber, the flutter of a curtain, the distant echo of a soldier's boots pacing the ramparts outside. Sleep had become a stranger to him. How could a man rest when he knew that the fate of a millennium slept on his shoulders? He was the last emperor of Byzantium, but he carried within him the ghosts of all who came before. Augustus, Constantine the Great, Justinian, Basil the Bulgar slayer, names that once made the earth tremble. Those emperors had ruled over continents, commanded armies that filled the horizon, and built cities that touched heaven. But now the once mighty empire had shrunk to a single, flickering flame. One city, one man, one final breath. Constantine was no stranger to loss. He had watched the empire crumble piece by piece since his youth. The fields of Greece abandoned, the islands seized, the proud cities of Asia Minor swallowed by the rising Ottoman tide. He had been crowned not out of triumph, but necessity. There was no one else left. He ruled over relics and ruins, over faith and memory. Yet in his heart, he believed, foolishly or faithfully, that duty was sacred even when hope was gone. He walked to the balcony, the hem of his cloak dragging across the cold marble floor. The first light of morning brushed against the walls, revealing the worn carvings of eagles and angels, their wings chipped and fading. He placed his hand upon the stone and closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost hear the voices of emperors past whispering through the marble. Defend her, die with her, if you must. But do not let her fall forgotten. Down below, the city stirred. The citizens of Constantinople were waking to another day beneath siege. Vendors would open their shutters, though they had nothing left to sell. Children would fetch water from wells that now ran thin. Priests would bless men who might not live to see another sunrise. And yet, life continued. That was the miracle of Constantinople. It refused to die quietly. Even surrounded, even starving, it breathed defiance. Constantine turned from the balcony and approached a small wooden chest. Inside lay his most cherished possession, not gold, not relics, but a worn map of the ancient empire. The ink had faded, the parchment cracked with age. He traced his finger across it. Rome, Athens, Antioch, Alexandria, each name once part of his inheritance. Now nothing more than memories in foreign hands. His finger stopped on Constantinople, circled in red, the last island of light in a sea of darkness. He thought of his ancestors, how proud they must have been when the city first rose from the ashes of the old world, a bridge between east and west, heaven and earth. Constantine the Great had envisioned it as a second Rome, eternal and divine. But even the eternal, he realized, could fade. Every empire believed it would never die. Every ruler thought his reign would last forever. And yet, history moved like a tide, washing away monuments, names, and dreams alike. There was a knock at the door. Constantine turned. It was Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had come with a small band of mercenaries to help defend the walls. His armor was dented, his face lined from sleepless nights, but his eyes burned with courage. "My emperor," Giustiniani said, bowing slightly, "the men ask for your presence at the walls. They say it strengthens them to see you." Constantine smiled faintly. "Do they think their emperor can stop the cannonballs with his bare hands?" Giustiniani smiled back. "No, Majesty, but they believe your courage makes them less afraid." Constantine nodded. "Then we shall give them that at least." As the two men walked through the corridors of the palace, the scent of incense and dust filled the air. They passed mosaics depicting saints and victories long forgotten, each tile chipped, each face worn by time. "You have fought many battles, Giovanni," Constantine said quietly. "Tell me truthfully, do you think we can hold the city?" Giustiniani hesitated. "I think we can make them bleed for it. I think we can show the world what it means to fight for something sacred." Constantine's gaze softened. then let that be our legacy. When they reached the outer walls, the emperor paused. Before him stretched the Theodosian walls, towering yet fractured, their stones scarred by the relentless pounding of Ottoman cannons. Beyond them, the enemy camp shimmered like a sea of iron, thousands of tents, banners, and fires stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was thick with the distant chant of prayers and war drums. And somewhere out there, Constantine knew, was Mehmed II, the young sultan who dreamed of glory, the boy who wanted to end an age. Constantine's heart ached not with hatred, but with recognition. He understood the fire of ambition. He too had once believed in destiny. Now he was living through its cruel end. He placed his hand upon the cracked stone of the wall. "This city," he said softly, "was built by faith and defended by dreams. If it must fall, let it fall with dignity." Justiniani bowed his head. "So it shall." The emperor looked once more toward the horizon. In the distance, the faint sound of thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from the great cannons known as basilicas, forged by Mehmed's engineers to break through walls once thought divine. The air trembled with each blast. Dust fell from the battlements like sand through an hourglass. He turned to his men, rows of weary soldiers in tattered armor, faces smeared with soot and hope. "Brothers," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "we are all Romans here, Greeks, Italians, Venetians, even strangers from far lands. But tonight, we share one name. We defend not just a city, but the memory of our fathers. We stand not for victory, but for honor." A murmur rose among the soldiers. Some crossed themselves, others raised their swords in silent salute. For a brief moment, fear was forgotten. They were united, not by nation or language, but by the shared knowledge that they were witnessing the final chapter of something far greater than themselves. As the sun sank toward the sea, the emperor lingered at the wall. The city glowed beneath the fading light, its domes and minarets bathed in gold and crimson. 1,000 years of history reflected in that dying sun. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for survival, but remembrance. "Lord, grant that we may be remembered not as those who lost Rome, but as those who refused to abandon her." That night, as darkness settled over Constantinople, Constantine returned to his chamber. He removed his armor piece by piece, setting it gently beside the candle. He sat again by the map, his hand hovering over the red circle around the city's name. He smiled faintly, almost wistfully. In another world, perhaps, he would have been a builder like Justinian, or a conqueror like Basil. But fate had chosen him to be the keeper of the end, to guard the flame until the last breath of wind extinguished it. And in that truth, he found peace. He looked once more out the window at the stars above the Bosphorus. "If this is the end of Rome," he whispered, "then let it be beautiful." The candle flickered, the wind sighed through the open archway, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled. The dream of Rome was fading. But its final guardian was ready to meet dawn. Across the waters of the Bosphorus, the air trembled with the rhythm of drums. It was not the careless thunder of chaos, but the ordered heartbeat of an empire on the rise. Beneath a vast field of tents stitched with crescents and stars, the army of the Ottomans stirred like a living sea. Torches swayed in the wind. Horses stamped the ground. The faint sound of prayer rippled through the camp, thousands of voices whispering as one. And at its center, young Mehmed II stood watching the dawn that would make him immortal. He was 21 years old, too young, some whispered, to carry such a burden. Yet his eyes held something older than years, a hunger carved by history itself. His father, Murad II, had taught him both mercy and war. His tutors had fed him the language of conquerors, Arabic, Greek, Persian, Latin. He read the Gospels and the Quran, Plato and Alexander, and from each he drew one conviction: that destiny was not inherited. It was seized. As the first light crept over the hills, Mehmed walked among his soldiers. They fell silent in his presence. He was not tall, but his composure commanded space. His armor, polished to mirror brightness, reflected the flames that danced around him. The morning wind tugged at the crimson plume on his helmet, and he breathed deeply, as if tasting history before devouring it. In his tent the night before, he had studied maps by lamplight. Constantinople lay like a prize between worlds, Europe and Asia, Christendom and Islam, past and future. The city was both symbol and key. For 1,000 years, it had mocked would-be conquerors. Even the Mongols had turned away. But Mehmed believed what others did not, that walls could not stop time, and time was on his side. He had built an empire around that belief. On the shores of the Bosphorus, he raised Rumeli Hisari, a fortress so vast its shadows reached the opposite bank. He commissioned a cannon so enormous it could hurl stone balls heavier than 100 men, the Basilica, forged by the Hungarian master Orban. He gathered fleets from every conquered coast, engineers from Persia, mathematicians from Cairo. No one in his court dared question his vision. They called him Fatih, the conqueror, though he had yet to earn the name. Still, in private moments, the young sultan carried unease like a secret. What if the dream consumed him before it was fulfilled? He remembered his father's weary sighs, the weight of crowns that crushed rather than crowned. Mehmed's ambition was not for gold or vengeance, but for immortality, to end an age and begin his own. And yet, when he looked across the strait at the shimmering walls of Constantinople, he felt the pull of something larger than ambition, destiny mixed with fear. That morning, his vizier, Zaganos Pasha, approached. "My sultan," he said, bowing deeply, "the cannons are ready. The men await your word." Mehmed nodded, but did not turn from the view. The sea between them glistened, pale and deceptive, as if trying to protect the ancient city from his gaze. "Do you hear it, Zaganos?" he asked quietly. "Hear what, my lord?" "The city. It breathes still, the bells, the prayers. They think their God will save them." A faint smile touched his lips. "Let them pray. Perhaps their angels will meet our cannons halfway." Zaganos dared a smile. "You sound certain, Majesty." "I am." Mehmed turned then, his eyes dark but alight. "I have been certain since I was 12, when I first saw those walls. My tutors said they were blessed, unbreakable, so I swore I would break them, not for glory, but for balance. The world cannot have two Romes." He walked toward his horse, a massive black stallion named Karabeh, its armor engraved with verses from the Quran. Around them, soldiers shouted praises and invocations. "Allahu Akbar, long live the Sultan!" The air quivered with energy, the kind that bends fate itself. Mehmed mounted and raised his sword high. The blade caught the light like liquid fire. "Brothers," he called out, his voice carrying across the camp. "Before us stands a city of marble and pride. Behind us stands history, waiting for a name to remember. we will give it that name. If I am destined to die, I will die at its gates. If I am destined to live, I will enter its halls as God's chosen servant. Either I conquer the city, or the city conquers me." The roar that followed shook the earth. That evening, Mehmed withdrew again to his tent. The noise of the camp faded into a low hum. He opened a small chest and took out a worn copy of Plutarch's Lives, its pages annotated in Greek. He read slowly, lips moving soundlessly. "Fortune favors the bold." The candlelight flickered, and for an instant he saw his reflection in the bronze surface of his helmet, not as a conqueror, but as a boy who once studied the stars, believing each one marked a soul awaiting remembrance. He prayed quietly, "Lord, grant that I do not act from arrogance. Let my hand serve your will, not my hunger." Outside, thunder rolled again, cannon testing in the dark. The ground quaked gently, dust raining from the roof beams. The Sultan extinguished his candle and stepped outside. From his hilltop camp, he could see the distant glow of Constantinople's lamps. The city seemed peaceful, almost unaware, but Mehmed knew peace could be deceptive. He admired its beauty, the domes, the faint music of bells drifting across the water. He understood, even respected, the faith of those who would die for it. But in his heart, he also believed that faith without renewal becomes decay. The next morning, he assembled his generals, Zaganos, Halil Pasha, Karaka Bey, inside a grand pavilion draped in silk. A table stood between them, covered with maps and wax seals. Mehmed pressed a finger against the parchment. "Here," he said, pointing to the gate of St. Romanus. "Here we strike. The walls are weakest there, and our cannon will tear them open. We build roads through Galata. We drag ships across land into the Golden Horn. If they hide behind their chains, we shall come from the north. There will be no escape." Halil Pasha frowned. "Majesty, the Venetians still negotiate peace. Perhaps—" "Enough." Mehmed's voice cut like steel. "Let the diplomats talk. We are the argument." Silence filled the tent. The generals bowed. Later, as the camp settled into night once more, Mehmed walked alone to the edge of the hill. The moon hung low, turning the Bosphorus silver. He thought of Alexander at the walls of Tyre, of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. The world remembered not those who waited, but those who acted. Yet he also thought of the cost, of cities burning, of mothers weeping. Greatness, he realized, demanded a kind of cruelty, and he was willing to bear it. He whispered to the wind, "If destiny is written, let it be written by my hand." Behind him, the drums began again, slow and relentless. The sound rolled across the valley, over the water, into the city beyond. It mingled with the tolling of distant bell, two worlds, two faiths, two histories, calling out to one another in the dark. By dawn, smoke would rise from the shores. The first cannon would roar. The sky would split open, and the boy Sultan from Edirne would begin to carve his name into eternity. The first cannon thundered on the morning of April 6th, 1453. The sound was like the sky itself cracking open. Men across both camps stopped what they were doing, soldiers, priests, merchants, beggars, and turned their faces towards the source. It was not just noise. It was the beginning of the end. A ripple passed through Constantinople. From the harbor to the high walls, people froze. The sound rolled through the streets like an invisible wave, shaking windows, stirring pigeons from rooftops. Then a second blast, then a third. The air thickened with dust and vibration. The world felt as though it had been struck by an unseen hammer. On the Theodosian walls, the defenders braced themselves. Giovanni Giustiniani, ever calm, raised his spyglass and watched the Ottoman guns belch smoke across the plain. "There," he said to Constantine, who stood beside him, "the great cannon, Orban's monster. They call it the Basilica. God help us all." Below, the ground trembled as massive stone balls, each weighing hundreds of pounds, slammed against the ancient walls. The first struck harmlessly, rolling away into the moat. The second cracked a portion of outer stone. The third shattered a section of tower, scattering fragments like shrapnel. Dust rose, choking the men atop the parapets. Yet, when the echoes faded, the defenders cheered. The walls still stood. "Rome is not so easily broken," Constantine said quietly. His armor gleamed with the morning light, though beneath the metal his body was already weary. For weeks he had slept little, eating what little was left: dried bread, olives, the bare rations of a city under siege. But his spirit remained sharp. He refused to let despair see his face. Across the plain, Mehmed II watched from his pavilion. His generals surrounded him, murmuring, studying the patterns of impact. The Sultan's gaze was steady. He was learning, measuring, calculating. Every volley brought him closer. Every sound of cracking stone was a hymn to his purpose. "Again," he ordered, his voice even. "Again, until the walls remember who commands the world." The cannons fired once more. By midday, the city's gates were shrouded in smoke. The smell of sulfur and oil filled the air. Priests carried icons along the ramparts, chanting prayers that mingled with the cries of soldiers. Bells tolled from every church. From Hagia Sophia, the sound of Mass echoed outward, defying the roar of artillery. Faith against fire, spirit against steel. Children clung to their mothers in narrow streets. Merchants hid their goods beneath floorboards. Even the stray dogs went silent, their instincts sensing the world's tremor. Yet, amid that chaos, there was beauty, the stubborn beauty of life continuing. Women brought water to soldiers, bandaged wounds, whispered blessings. Old men carried buckets of sand to smother flames. The empire's strength was not in its armies, but in its endurance. Night fell, and the bombardment stopped. The sudden silence felt unnatural, oppressive. Smoke hung low over the city like a veil. Fires glowed along the outer wall where cannonballs had struck. Constantine stood with Giustiniani, gazing into the dark fields beyond. "They will come again at dawn," Giustiniani said. "Yes," the emperor replied, "but so will the light." He turned and looked toward Hagia Sophia, its vast dome faintly illuminated by torchlight. The golden cross atop it shimmered faintly, even through the haze. He thought of his ancestors, emperors crowned beneath that dome, their voices rising in triumph. Now it was a place of refuge, filled with the frightened and the faithful. He wondered if they prayed for victory or simply for mercy. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed did not sleep. He sat before a brazier, flames reflecting in his eyes. The map of Constantinople spread across his knees. His engineers reported that the cannons were performing well, but would need repair. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "They will rest tonight," he said, "but we will not." He rose and walked toward the shore. The Bosphorus lay black and still, the reflection of the moon rippling softly. The faint glow of the city could be seen across the water, golden and silent. Mehmed's heart tightened. He admired its endurance. It was, in a way, beautiful, this ancient city refusing to bow. Yet beauty, he thought, does not make something eternal. Only conquest does. He whispered a verse from the Quran under his breath, steady and calm. With hardship comes ease. Then he turned to his guards. At dawn, he said, we fire again. The next morning, the siege intensified. The Ottomans attacked not only with cannon, but with ingenuity. Bridges were built across the moats under cover of night. Arrows carried messages wrapped in flame. Miners tunneled beneath the walls, planting explosives. Each day the city trembled a little more, the cracks widening, the dust thickening, the prayers growing more desperate. Inside Constantinople, Constantine refused to yield. He rode through the streets on horseback, greeting soldiers by name, blessing children, encouraging priests. This is our home, he told them. Every stone, every sound, every tear, we will not give it away. His voice carried warmth, not of command, but of shared destiny. In quiet moments, he prayed alone in the palace chapel. The flicker of candlelight danced across his face, illuminating exhaustion and serenity in equal measure. Lord, he whispered, if my people must fall, let them fall with grace. If my name must be forgotten, let the city remember. Days passed into weeks. The cannon fire became a rhythm as constant as breath. People began to measure time not by sunrise or sunset, but by bombardment and silence. The walls bled dust, the streets filled with rubble. Yet still, the city endured. Its people sang hymns even as stones fell from the sky. One evening, a messenger from the Ottoman lines approached under a white flag. He was led through the gates and brought before Constantine. The young man bowed and spoke in broken Greek. My Sultan sends his offer. Surrender, and he will spare the city. You will be given rule of Morea. The people will live. Constantine listened, eyes calm. When the messenger finished, the emperor simply said, Tell your sultan this. To surrender would be to lose our souls. We were born to guard this city, and we will die doing so. The messenger hesitated, then nodded. So be it, he whispered. That night, Constantine stood once more upon the wall. The stars burned bright over the Bosphorus. The sea was quiet, almost indifferent to the suffering of men. He thought of his childhood when his mother told him stories of Alexander, of Troy, of heroes who fought not to win, but to be remembered. He smiled faintly. Perhaps, he murmured, that is all any of us can ask. Below, the Ottoman fires shimmered like constellations across the earth. The world's fate was being written in their glow. And above, the ancient city still stood, weary, wounded, but unbroken. For now. The walls of Theodosius had watched the world change for more than 1,000 years. They had seen crusaders and emperors, earthquakes and coronations, fire and famine. Yet still they stood, tier upon tier of marble and limestone, rising like the ribs of some great ancient beast. To the people of Constantinople, they were not mere fortifications. They were a covenant. As long as the walls held, the city lived. But by May of 1453, the covenant was cracking. Dust hung in the morning air like mist. From a distance, the walls still looked proud, gleaming in the slanted sunlight. But up close, they were bleeding. Torn stone, splintered mortar, great gaps patched with timber and sandbags. Every night, men and women toiled beneath torchlight, dragging stones from ruined houses to fill the breaches. Priests sprinkled holy water over the walls, whispering Latin prayers between the crash of hammers. Each blow was both a repair and a requiem. Emperor Constantine XI rode slowly along the ramparts. His horse picked its way through rubble and broken arrow shafts. Wherever he passed, soldiers straightened, saluting with weary smiles. Many were foreigners, Italians from Genoa and Venice, a handful of Spaniards, even a few Germans drawn by faith or adventure. Yet in these final days, all called themselves Romans. Constantine dismounted near the gate of St. Romanus, where the damage was worst. There, Giovanni Giustiniani stood beside a great iron cannonball lodged halfway into the wall, its rim still warm from impact. His armor was black with soot, his voice hoarse from shouting commands. "She's holding," Giustiniani said, though the strain in his tone betrayed doubt. "Barely." Constantine nodded. "Then she shall keep holding." He knelt and pressed his gloved hand against the stone. The heat pulsed faintly through the leather. "These walls were built when Rome still remembered its strength," he said softly. "They were meant to last forever. Perhaps that is what forever looks like. Not endless years, but refusing to fall even when you should." Giustiniani studied the emperor's face, the lines deepened by sleeplessness and smoke. "If they breach here, Majesty, this will be the place." "Then this," Constantine replied, "will be where we meet them." Below, along the moat, hundreds of citizens labored with buckets and shovels. Some were monks, others merchants, even children barely in their teens. They carried stones, hauled timbers, filled wagons with rubble. The city had no armies left to spare, so it gave what it had, its people. Every blow of the hammer, every heaved stone was a prayer made solid. From the towers came the ring of bells calling volunteers to repair shifts. From the churches came the scent of incense drifting on the wind, mingling with the acrid smoke of gunpowder. That evening, when the cannons paused, the defenders gathered on the ramparts. The sunset turned the sea to molten gold. For a few stolen moments, there was quiet. Only the gulls, the creak of ropes, the soft clatter of tools being set aside. Constantine joined them, standing shoulder to shoulder with peasants and nobles alike. "Look well," he said. "The sun sets upon the same city it rose over 1,000 years ago. Whatever comes tomorrow, no one can take this moment from us." A young soldier beside him, his face smeared with ash, whispered, "Will the walls hold, sire?" Constantine placed a hand on his shoulder. "They will hold as long as we do." Night came swiftly. Torches flared along the battlements, throwing long shadows across the stone. The sound of digging echoed from below, Ottoman miners working through the dark to undermine the foundations. Giustiniani's men listened, their ears pressed to the ground. When they heard the faint scrape of picks, they knew what must be done. Buckets of oil and fire were lowered into the tunnels. Flames roared up through the earth, collapsing the passages and sealing them with ash. Cheers erupted, brief and exhausted. At dawn, the bombardment resumed. The basilica cannon roared, its echo rolling like thunder across the Marmara. The ground shook, dust rose in choking clouds, and men clung to the walls to steady themselves. Great chunks of masonry tumbled into the moat below. Still, the defenders returned fire with small cannons of their own, their shots feeble but defiant. The clash was not equal. It was never meant to be. But courage filled the space where power had failed. Giustiniani fought everywhere at once, directing archers, hauling ropes, commanding engineers to rebuild. His voice carried above the chaos, "Hold the line! Aim for the gunners!" Arrows whistled through the haze, striking men at the Ottoman batteries. For every defender that fell, two more stepped forward to take his place. Constantine moved among them, bareheaded now, his face streaked with grime. "Brothers," he shouted, "this wall is the heart of the world. If it falls, the world will forget what Rome was." The soldiers roared in reply. From the plains beyond, Mehmed watched through a spyglass. He saw the resilience, the madness, the faith. He admired it even as he vowed to crush it. Turning to his vizier, he said quietly, "They rebuild what we destroy. They pray where we bleed them. They do not understand the age has changed." Zaganos Pasha replied, "Then make them understand, my Sultan." That night, rain began to fall, slow at first, then heavy, drumming against stone and steel. The fires hissed, the smoke turned to steam. The city seemed to breathe again, cleansing itself in the downpour. Constantine stood beneath the battlements, the rain streaming down his armor, and felt for the first time the strange calm that comes after exhaustion. Lightning flashed, illuminating the battered walls, their cracks glistening like veins of silver. He turned to Giustiniani. "She's beautiful, even broken." Giustiniani smiled faintly. "So are we, Majesty." They shared a moment of silence, listening to the rain. Somewhere in the distance, a choir began to sing from Hagia Sophia, low voices rising through the storm. The melody reached the walls, mingling with thunder. Even the Ottoman soldiers paused to listen. The strange, haunting sound drifting across the plain. By dawn, the rain had cleared, leaving behind a gray, heavy sky. The defenders returned to their posts, eyes red from sleeplessness. The walls were weaker now, visibly bowed in places, entire sections sagging where the mortar had crumbled, yet still they stood. Still they defied. Constantine looked upon them and felt something that was neither pride nor sorrow, but reverence. These stones had outlasted empires. They were monuments to human stubbornness, to the refusal to surrender what is sacred. "When they finally fall," he whispered, "they will fall forward." And as he spoke, a single block of marble, loosened by the constant pounding, slipped from the upper rampart and tumbled into the moat below. It struck with a deep, resonant crash that echoed through the morning mist, a heartbeat of stone. The men turned toward the sound, silent. Constantine closed his eyes. So it begins. He knew then that the walls could not endure forever. But perhaps that was never their purpose. Perhaps their purpose was simply to teach men how to stand, unyielding, in the face of the inevitable. When the cannons fired again, the defenders no longer flinched. They had become part of the walls themselves, living stones in the last architecture of Rome. And as the sun climbed higher, gilding every scar and fracture in light, the emperor whispered to himself, almost prayerfully, "Let the world remember what strength looked like, even as it broke." Inside the walls, Constantinople had become a world unto itself, suspended between faith and fear, light and ruin. The streets that once bustled with trade now lay half empty, echoing with the shuffle of tired feet and the low murmur of prayers. Every district smelled of smoke and candle wax. The people lived in a kind of twilight, neither alive with hope nor dead with despair, but trapped in the long pause before history takes its breath. The siege had stripped away every illusion of grandeur. Gone were the days of gold mosaics and perfumed courtyards. Now even the noblest families cooked thin soups of lentils and rainwater over small fires. Bakers rationed their flour by the handful. Wine was diluted until it tasted like ash. But still, each evening, they gathered in their churches, lighting candles that flickered against ancient icons. The faces of saints, worn by centuries of devotion, watched them with solemn pity. In the heart of the city stood Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, the soul of Byzantium. Its vast dome still caught the light even through the smoke, as though heaven itself refused to turn away. On nights when cannon fire paused, the city gathered there, emperors and beggars alike. The marble floor was cold beneath their knees, the air thick with incense and whispered psalms. Mothers clutched their children, merchants clung to relics, old men wept quietly. They prayed not for victory anymore, but for meaning, for the strength to endure what must come. One woman, Eleni, a widow from the Blackernay quarter, came every night. Her husband had died at the walls 2 weeks before, his body never found. She came barefoot, carrying their son, a boy no older than 6. The child always asked the same question, his voice small beneath the echoes. "Mama, will the angels save us?" And every night she gave the same answer, the only one she could bear to speak. "They already have my love. They keep us brave." In another part of the city, a group of monks from the monastery of Staudios worked in silence, copying manuscripts by candlelight. Their ink froze in the chill, their hands shook, but still they wrote. One monk, his beard singed from a nearby fire, paused and looked up. "Do you think anyone will read these?" he asked. The elder beside him smiled faintly. "If they do not, then the act itself was the prayer." Elsewhere, in the Forum of Constantine, soldiers gathered around small fires, sharpening blades and whispering to one another. Their armor was mismatched, some Venetian, some Byzantine, some scavenged from the fallen. The men spoke in half a dozen languages, but shared one understanding. This was the last stand of something sacred. A Genoese archer passed around a piece of hard bread, breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces until every man had a crumb. They ate as though partaking in communion. One said quietly, "If we fall, perhaps the world will finally wake." In the palace, Emperor Constantine XI moved through the dark halls, visiting each barracks, each infirmary. He greeted the wounded by name, pressing their hands, whispering blessings. In one corner, a young soldier knelt beside a dying comrade. Constantine paused beside them. The dying man looked up, eyes glassy. "Majesty," he whispered, "we held the gate." The emperor knelt. "And you held Rome itself, my son. Rest easy." The man smiled faintly, exhaled, and was gone. Constantine closed his eyes, then rose and whispered to his aides, "Carry him to Hagia Sophia. Let him sleep where the empire sleeps." Everywhere he went, the people bowed their heads, not in ceremony, but in affection. He was no longer an emperor of dominion. He had become an emperor of endurance. The city no longer needed a ruler, it needed a heart, and that heart beat, quietly but steadily, in him. Outside, the Ottoman drums never ceased. Day and night, the ground trembled. Sometimes the sound came closer, as if the earth itself were marching. Yet inside the city, the citizens found small defiance in beauty. Children painted crosses on the walls with bits of charcoal. Musicians played soft hymns on lutes and flutes, their notes fragile against the roar of war. In a small square near the sea walls, an old man carved tiny crosses from olive wood and handed them to passing strangers. "For courage," he said, "for remembrance." By mid-May, Sickness had begun to spread, fever from the unburied, thirst from the tainted wells. The smell of death clung to the air, but the people moved through it with quiet resignation. They had stopped counting the days. The siege was not measured in time anymore, but in faith. Some believed a miracle would come, perhaps a Venetian fleet, perhaps an angelic host descending from heaven. Others knew better, but still they prayed, because prayer gave shape to their waiting. On the 20th night of the siege, the moon rose blood-red over the Bosphorus. The people gathered on rooftops and balconies, whispering in awe and dread. A sign, some said. The end, others whispered. In the palace, Constantine watched it rise through a broken window. The color was uncanny, deep, bruised crimson. Even he felt the old superstition stirring. Yet, instead of fear, he felt calm. The moon has seen empires rise and fall, he murmured. It will see what follows us too. In Hagia Sophia, that same night, the city's last full mass was held. The cathedral was overflowing, every aisle, every corner, every stair. Candles flickered like stars beneath the vast dome. The air trembled with song. The emperor himself entered quietly without guards and knelt among the people. The patriarch's voice rose above the crowd, trembling with emotion. Brothers and sisters, this may be our last night together in the sight of God. Let us not pray for deliverance, but for courage. Let us show heaven that even in defeat we did not forget the light. When communion was offered, the line stretched endlessly. Constantine received the sacrament beside soldiers, fishermen, widows, and children. In that moment, titles meant nothing. The Emperor of Rome stood shoulder to shoulder with his people, and for the first time in centuries, there was no distance between crown and commoner. They were all simply Byzantines, bound by faith and fate. Outside, thunder rolled from the Ottoman camp. The ground shook. Dust fell from the mosaics. Yet the singing did not stop. It rose higher, defiant, echoing through the marble halls and out into the night. The words were ancient, but their meaning was eternal. Lord, have mercy. When the service ended, no one wanted to leave. Some slept against the columns. Others lingered in prayer. The emperor stood at the great bronze doors, watching his people, his family, and whispered, "If this is our end, let it be worthy of the beginning." He stepped outside into the cool night air. The city lay before him, silent, fractured, glimmering faintly in the moonlight. From the distant hills came the faint hum of Ottoman chants, the metallic ring of hammers repairing cannon. Between those two sounds, the prayers of his people and the machines of his enemy, Constantine understood the full weight of the world's turning. Tomorrow, he said softly to himself, we will see the face of history. And as he walked back toward the palace, the bells of Hagia Sophia tolled once more, slow, solemn, beautiful, each note carrying across the Bosphorus like a farewell whispered to the centuries. It began with a wind that smelled of iron and rain, sweeping over the battered stones like a hand closing a book. The city sealed its shutters, lamps dimmed, voices fell to whispers. Even the gulls vanished from the harbors as though the heavens themselves had grown still. Constantinople settled into the night that would decide everything, a night when time itself seemed to pause. Emperor Constantine XI dismissed his escort and walked alone through the palace archway. He wanted to hear his own footsteps on the stones of the dying empire. He passed a broken fountain, its water trickling silver into dust. A single loaf rested on a window-sill, someone's last act of hope for morning. Every doorway, every cracked icon carried the intimacy of farewell. The city felt alive in its silence, holding its breath with him. He climbed the ramparts at the gate of St. Romanus, where Giovanni Giustiniani worked by torchlight, a bandage dark on his shoulder. "Majesty," he said, "the breach is braced with timber and prayer. Both will need renewing by dawn." Constantine touched the trembling wood. "Then we shall renew them," he said, "at dawn, and again, if we're granted dusk." Below them, the Ottoman camp glowed like an ember field, thousands of torches flickering in the rain. Drums pulsed faintly. Somewhere, a muezzin's voice rose, haunting and pure. Constantine listened without hate. "May he meet a worthy defense," he murmured. Giustiniani nodded. The two men walked the line together, speaking softly to every guard, every boy who clutched a bow with shaking hands. Their words were simple: stand, breathe, endure. Within Hagia Sophia the city prayed. The patriarch's voice trembled as he offered the final blessings. Candles burned low. The air shimmered with incense and fear. Among the kneeling crowd, the widow Eleni held her son close. "Is tonight the night?" the boy whispered. "Tonight we hold each other," she answered. "That is all anyone truly has." Her words seemed to linger, reaching beyond the cathedral's walls to the countless others huddled in silence. At the harbor, the chains across the Golden Horn creaked under the wind. Ottoman ships rocked patiently, their lanterns drifting like red stars. Up on the Galata hillside, the miracle of ships dragged overland gleamed faintly, a forest of masts waiting in shadow. Even from afar, the sight was enough to chill the defenders' hearts. Ingenuity had joined the siege. Rain began close to midnight, not heavy but fine and cold, threading down the cracked stone. The sound was soft, almost comforting. The city seemed to sigh. Constantine welcomed it. The rain masked the smoke and cooled the aching air. He walked again along the inner streets, past shuttered homes and burned-out shops. Somewhere a woman sang to a child. Somewhere a man wept quietly, alone. The emperor stopped before a small chapel door, placed his hand against the worn wood, and whispered, "Let them rest. Let them not see what morning brings." Back in this palace chapel he knelt. His sword lay across the steps like an offering. He prayed not for victory, but for grace, that when fear came, he might meet it with stillness. "If courage must have a body," he murmured, "let it be mine." He rose, wrote a few final letters to his family in Morea, to a cousin far away, to no one who would ever receive them. Each ended the same. "We did not choose the storm, only how to stand within it. Near the sea walls, surgeons stitched wounds by candlelight. A monk murmured scripture as he worked. Across the alley, a nun brewed bitter tea from bark and herbs. The siege had stripped away rank. Now there were only those who mended, those who fought, and those who prayed. The sound of hammers fixing armor blended with whispered hymns, small acts of creation against destruction. Then came the light, not dawn, but a reddish glow rising over the plain. The Ottoman camp was stirring. The torches multiplied. Trumpets sounded once, twice, then again. The drums thickened, the rhythm of destiny gathering speed. From the walls, the defenders watched in silence. Giustiniani climbed a tower and saw the banners unfurling, a tide of green and black. "They move before dawn," he said. Constantine's reply was calm. Then we answer before dawn. Runners spread through the city carrying his order, prepare the last defense. The Greek fire was brought from its hiding place, guarded like a holy relic. Priests lifted the icon of the Virgin Hodegetria, carrying it along the ramparts. Wherever it passed, men knelt, pressing hands to hearts. For a fleeting moment, the city's terror softened into unity. The emperor rode to the inner gate, the rain glistening on his armor. He chose a scarred horse, whispering to it as if to a comrade, "You and I will go where the ground breaks." As he rode the walls, voices rose in greeting, "Basilius?" He nodded to each, a silent vow returned. Across the plain, Sultan Mehmed stood beneath a vast black banner trimmed in gold. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw tight. The youth in his face was gone, replaced by something harder, belief. Behind him, the Janissaries formed perfect ranks, their spears like a forest of steel. He lifted his arm. The drums quickened. The two worlds stared across the darkness at each other, united by the same breath before impact. Then the cannons roared. The sound was unbearable. The earth itself convulsed. The basilica cannon spat fire, shaking the walls like thunderclaps from the gods. Stones leapt free, dust filled lungs, cries and commands merged in a single surge of noise. Arrows hissed, flames licked along the ramparts. Smoke turned night into a storm of gold and shadow. A tower crumbled, spilling men into the moat below. Constantine shouted above the chaos, "Hold! Hold the line!" His sword gleamed as he struck aside a scaling hook, driving it free. Justiniani was everywhere at once, rallying archers, sealing breaches, shouting orders through blood and smoke. When he stumbled from a wound, he tied a strip of cloth and kept moving. "Later," he muttered. Later. The defenders fought like men fighting gravity itself. In Hagia Sophia, the bells answered the guns. Eleni sang softly to her son, drowning the thunder with an old lullaby. "Why do they fight so hard?" he asked. She pressed his face to her shoulder. "Because love is stubborn," she said. "Because stories need endings." Rumors spread, whispers of Venetian sails on the horizon. Men turned their eyes toward the Marmara, seeing only rain. Yet even the lie fed them for a moment. Hope, fragile and fleeting, is still a kind of strength. Constantine heard the rumor too and smiled sadly. "Let them believe it," he told a captain. "Hope costs nothing and buys another hour." The assault raged on. The smell of oil and burning cloth filled the air. Greek fire poured from the ramparts, cascading over ladders, turning night into furnace. Still, the Ottomans climbed, disciplined, relentless. The defenders pushed them back with spears and stones, shouting, praying, bleeding. The emperor fought beside them, his voice hoarse, his armor dented, his faith unbroken. Hours passed, like years. The rain turned to mist. The cannon fire slowed. From the Ottoman camp rose the call to prayer, deep, solemn, echoing. The Byzantines answered with hymns, two faiths overlapping in the twilight. For a moment it sounded less like war and more like mourning. Justiniani limped to Constantine's side, face pale beneath the grime. "Majesty," he gasped, "the wall won't last another day." The emperor nodded. "Then we will give it our names," he said quietly. "If the stones fall, they will fall through us." They clasped forearms. No more words were needed. Each man knew the dawn would bring the end. Constantine stood at the breach, staring east. The first pale light of morning bled into the clouds, brushing the sea with silver. The world was holding its breath again. He thought of Constantine the Great, the founder of this city, and wondered if the first emperor could feel the last one watching the same sunrise. The symmetry was cruel and perfect. He whispered the prayer that had carried him through every hour. Let it be beautiful. A faint wind stirred. Somewhere a rooster crowed, ordinary, absurd, defiant. Soldiers laughed softly at the sound, the laughter of men who had nothing left to fear. It was brief, but it was real. The city's final heartbeat of joy. The longest night was ending. Dawn had not yet broken, but it was coming, and with it the final test of every soul within those walls, whether to stand, to flee, or simply to remember. Constantine turned to his men. "Brothers," he said, "this is where the world will pause before it changes. Make it pause for us." And they did. The city, battered, bleeding, sacred, chose to stand. Dawn came without color. A gray, wind-torn light spread across the Bosphorus, revealing a world made of smoke and mud. The rain had stopped, but the ground steamed where fire had fallen during the night. From the plain below the walls rose a low murmur. Thousands of voices reciting prayers, sharpening blades, whispering to the rising sun. The Ottoman camp was no longer a sea of tents. It was a single, breathing creature. The drums began again, slower now, deliberate, as if counting down the final seconds of an age. On the ramparts of the gate of St. Romanus, Emperor Constantine XI tightened the strap of his gauntlet. The steel felt heavier than it had yesterday, or perhaps his arms were simply more tired. Around him, the defenders moved with the ritual calm of men who already understood their fate. No one spoke of victory anymore. They spoke of minutes, how many the walls could grant them before the flood broke through. Giustiniani appeared, pale and rigid, his wounded arm bound to his chest. "They're forming ranks, Majesty." Constantine looked beyond the smoke. The Ottoman lines stretched endlessly, banners rippling black and green. "Then the world has come to our gate," he said softly. "Let us open it well." A moment later, the basilica cannon thundered. The ground heaved. Dust exploded outward like breath from a dying giant. Stones screamed as they tore free from mortar. The air filled with shrapnel, bits of history itself, turned into weapons. A second shot followed, then a third. With each blast, a section of wall collapsed inward, spilling rubble into the moat. The defenders stumbled, choking on powder and smoke. When the dust cleared, a gap yawned where the wall had been, jagged, black, and wide enough for an army. From the plain below rose a single shout. Then thousands joined it. The Ottoman horns blared. The assault had begun. Wave after wave surged toward the breach. The first were Bashi bazooks, wild irregulars who fought for plunder and redemption. They charged screaming, their banners soaked in rain, their armor mismatched. Arrows poured down from the walls, a rain of iron. Greek fire followed, glowing arcs that hissed through the air and burst into flame among the attackers. The front ranks fell, but the next ranks climbed over them. For every man who died, two more advanced. Constantine drew his sword and stepped forward. "With me!" he shouted, his voice breaking against the roar. His soldiers answered, closing ranks around him. For a heartbeat, it was no longer emperor and subjects. It was simply men holding a line together. They met the first wave head-on in the breach, steel against steel, shield against shield. The clash sounded like the grinding of worlds. From the tower above, Giustiniani's gunners fired down until the barrels glowed red. "Pour sand!" he cried. Sparks burst like stars. Then a cry. Giustiniani staggered backward, struck in the side by a fragment of stone. Blood darkened his tunic. His men caught him before he fell. "Get me to the ships," he gasped. The rumor spread within minutes. Giustiniani is gone. Courage wavered like a candle in the wind. Constantine saw the confusion and raised his sword. "Giustiniani fought for Rome," he shouted. "Now Rome fights for him. There is no retreat." His words cut through the noise. The defenders rallied, dragging carts, beams, and corpses alike to block the gap. Behind them, monks carried icons from the churches, planting them on the shattered wall as if to hold heaven to the earth. The next wave was the Anatolian infantry, disciplined and silent. They moved like a single tide, shields lifted, ladders ready. Arrows thudded against their ranks, but they did not slow. Constantine swung again and again, his arms numb, his sword slick with rain and blood. Around him the noise became a blur, screams, prayers, cannon, thunder. At times he thought he heard music, though none was playing, only the ringing in his ears, the sound of the city's heartbeat breaking. Far behind the lines, Sultan Mehmed II watched from horseback. The smoke parted briefly, and he saw the emperor's banner still flying above the breach, a crimson cross on white silk, tattered but defiant. He turned to Zaganas Pasha. "Send the Janissaries," he said. His voice was calm, almost weary. "End it!" The Janissaries advanced in perfect formation, drums and flutes marking their rhythm. They moved through the carnage left by those before them, over the dead, over the broken ladders, through the moat half filled with bodies. Their steps never faltered. They were the empire's heart made flesh, sworn to the Sultan's will. As they reached the wall, they began to climb, disciplined, methodical, unstoppable. Inside the city, the bells of Hagia Sophia began to ring again, faster now, desperate, each toll answering the drums outside. The sound merged with the roar of battle into something beyond music, a single, vast vibration that shook every stone. Women carried water to the gates. Children fetched arrows. Priests tended the wounded. No one waited idly. Every soul found a place in the defense. Then came the breach itself. A section of the inner wall split apart under cannon fire, showering men with debris. The defenders reeled. Through the smoke poured the Janissaries. The collision was blinding, steel and dust and the flash of torches snatched from the ground. Constantine was in the midst of it, his cloak torn away, his helmet dented. He no longer looked like an emperor. He looked like a man carved from the same stone that surrounded him. He fought until the sword in his hand bent. Then he seized another from the fallen and kept fighting. "Push them back!" he shouted. For a moment, astonishingly, they did. The Janissaries stumbled. The defenders surged, driving them toward the moat. Hope flared, thin, miraculous. But from the flank, a new detachment appeared, fresh troops pouring through a smaller, forgotten gate, opened by mistake or betrayal. The defenders turned too late. The tide reversed. Smoke blinded them. Fire crawled along the timbers. Constantine could see nothing but shapes, friends, enemies, all shadows in the haze. He heard his own name shouted from somewhere behind. The Emperor is with us. It gave the men a final spark. They formed a circle around him, fighting outward, step by step. Each time a man fell, another closed the gap. At the center of that circle, Constantine looked once toward the city he loved. Through the smoke he glimpsed domes, rooftops, the faint gleam of the Bosphorus. He thought of the monks copying scriptures, The mothers singing, the candles burning in Hagia Sophia. All of it felt impossibly distant and heartbreakingly near. He whispered, "Lord, remember them." A janissary lunged. Constantine struck, parried, struck again. His sword shattered. He drew his dagger. A blade caught his side, another his arm. He dropped to one knee, blood soaking the dust. The circle around him tightened, then broke. Someone cried out, "The emperor is dead." Others shouted, "No, he lives." In the confusion, the legend was born. No one saw exactly when he fell or where. Some swore they saw him stripped of his purple, fighting as a common soldier until the end. Others believed he vanished into the press of men, swallowed by destiny itself. By mid-morning, the walls were lost. The city's gates burst open, Ottoman banners rose above the towers, trumpets blared, and a sound rolled through the streets that had never been heard there before. The cry of Allahu Akbar, echoing within Roman stone. The defenders who still lived fell back toward the harbor, some trying to reach the ships, others fleeing to the churches. In Hagia Sophia, the people gathered one last time, believing the angels would descend. Instead, the doors burst open, and the tide of conquest swept in. On the field outside, Mehmed II dismounted and walked through the breach. Smoke curled around him. He stepped carefully over fallen men, Christian and Muslim alike, and paused where the walls met the open city. The wind carried a faint scent of incense mixed with powder. He removed his helmet and looked upward at the broken battlements. "So this," he whispered, "is the end of Rome." Then, more softly, "and the beginning of mine." Behind him, the cannons fell silent for the first time in 50 days. The air held only the crackle of fires and the rustle of flags being raised. In that strange hush, birds returned, circling above the smoke. The siege was finished. The Middle Ages had ended not with a trumpet of angels, but with the quiet exhalation of a world that had finally run its course. Somewhere beneath the rubble, among the nameless dead, lay the last emperor of Byzantium, his face lost, his story unending. And around him, the city he loved continued to burn, brilliant even in ruin, like a star collapsing into a new kind of light. The sun had risen fully now, but its light felt wrong, too bright, too bare. Smoke still drifted from the broken walls, twisting in the air like the ghosts of everything that had been lost. The city was silent in the way only conquered cities are, the soundless pause between destruction and realization. From the ruined gate, Sultan Mehmed II rode forward at a slow walk. His armor was blackened with soot, his horse flecked with ash. Around him, the janissaries marched in ordered silence, their eyes wide, their faces unreadable. The scent of fire and salt water mingled in the wind. It was the smell of an ending and a beginning. As the Sultan entered the city, he saw what the siege had done. Streets that once held markets and laughter were now littered with debris. Marble statues lay shattered. Smoke rose from the houses near the harbor. Dogs prowled among the fallen, and above it all, faint and steady, the bells of Hagia Sophia still rang, cracked and uneven, as though even the bronze resisted surrender. Mehmed reined in his horse at the Forum of Constantine, where weeds grew between the stones. He dismounted and stood for a long moment, looking toward the domes that crowned the skyline. The wind lifted his cloak. "So this is the Queen of Cities," he said quietly. "She fought like one." Zaganos Pasha approached, bowing low. "Majesty, the troops await your command. The spoils, the prisoners—" "Later," Mehmed interrupted. His gaze never left the city's heart. First, I must see her soul. He walked on foot toward Hagia Sophia, his boots crunching on broken glass. Around him, soldiers parted wordlessly. Some reached for relics, others wept. Unsure whether from triumph or exhaustion, even victory felt heavy here. The city's beauty, though wounded, humbled them. When Mehmed reached the cathedral's great bronze doors, he paused. They were scarred, but still standing, carved with crosses worn smooth by centuries of hands. He placed his palm against the metal, feeling the coolness seep into his skin. Then he pushed. The doors groaned open. Inside, the air was thick with incense and dust. Candles flickered along the aisles, left by those who had prayed through the night. The mosaics, gold and sapphire, glimmered faintly through the haze. At the center of the vast space, under the dome that once seemed to float upon light, the Sultan stopped. He had read of this place as a boy. The Temple of Emperors, the house built by Justinian to touch heaven. Now it belonged to him. The thought did not bring joy, only awe. For a long time he said nothing. He simply looked, his eyes following the curve of the dome, the light filtering through shattered windows, the doves still circling high above. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. His voice echoed, soft and reverent, swallowed by the vastness. He removed a handful of dust from the floor, rubbed it between his fingers, and let it fall again. All this, he murmured, and yet still dust. Behind him, an imam entered and knelt, spreading a simple rug on the marble floor. The soldiers followed suit, removing their helmets, bowing their heads. For the first time in its 1,000-year history, Hagia Sophia echoed with the call to prayer in Arabic. The words rose not as conquest, but as requiem, the old world yielding to the new. Outside, the people of Constantinople watched from doorways and alleys. Some crossed themselves, others simply stared. They did not understand the language, but they understood the tone, solemn, almost sorrowful. The Sultan was not mocking their faith, he was mourning its passing. When the prayer ended, Mehmed stood again and looked around. His eyes rested on the altar, where candles still burned. He walked to it, placed his hand on the edge, and whispered something that only those nearest could hear. So many kings have dreamed of this moment. None could bear it. Zarganos approached carefully. Majesty, the city awaits your decree. Mehmed turned, his face calm but pale. No looting within the walls, no fire in the churches. This city has seen enough flames. His officers hesitated. This was not what they expected, but one look from him silenced protest. I did not come to destroy Rome, he said. I came to inherit it. He left the cathedral and climbed the steps to its outer terrace. From there, he could see the Bosphorus glimmering under the morning light, dotted with the silhouettes of ships. Smoke drifted from the palaces, the markets, the docks. The wind carried faint cries, grief, disbelief, prayer. He felt the weight of them all. For a long moment he stood motionless, a figure carved against the rising sun. Then he drew his cloak tighter and said quietly, Now she will live again. His attendants waited for him to mount, but he did not. He walked instead through the streets, touching the walls, the fountains, the stones still warm from battle. In one alley, he saw a child sitting beside his dead father, clutching a small wooden cross. Mehmed knelt and placed a coin in the child's hand. Keep it, he said gently. It buys bread in any empire. He rose and turned toward the sea. The city stretched before him, broken but magnificent. "She will heal," he whispered. "So will I." That evening, as twilight deepened, the Sultan returned to his tent outside the walls. The air was quiet now, save for the crackle of small fires and the distant toll of a single bell. He sat alone, unarmored, his face lit by the soft glow of the lamp. On the table before him lay two objects, a stone taken from the breach and a small gilded icon recovered from the ruins. He looked from one to the other, the old faith and the new order, and felt a strange ache in his chest. His secretary entered quietly. "Majesty, the chroniclers ask what name they shall record for today." Mehmed thought for a moment. "The conquest of Constantinople," he said slowly, "but not the fall. Empires do not fall. They change their clothes." The secretary bowed and withdrew. Mehmed sat for a long time after, listening to the night. The wind carried fragments of chant from Hagia Sophia, now transformed into a mosque. The melody was unfamiliar, yet hauntingly beautiful. He closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw the faces of the men who had died, theirs and his. He saw the city as it had been, a living legend, radiant and proud. And for the first time since dawn, tears welled in his eyes. They were not tears of regret nor triumph, but of comprehension. To take a city so old was to inherit all its ghosts. He whispered to the silence, "May God forgive what men do in His name." Outside, the moon rose pale over the Bosphorus. The fires dimmed. Constantinople slept, some in peace, others in grief, all under a single uncertain sky. And in the Sultan's tent, the young conqueror who had dreamed of eternity sat alone beside the relics of the empire he had slain, realizing that victory too has a weight, and that even destiny can make a man weep. Morning broke soft and colorless over the Bosphorus, a veil of mist turning sea and sky into the same pale silver. The smoke had thinned, but it still clung to the domes and minarets like breath that would not quite leave the body. Constantinople, Byzantium, Nova Roma, the queen of cities, had awoken to a world that no longer knew her name. The streets were strangely quiet. Here and there, a door hung open to a home without its family. Candles still guttered in windows from the night before. Stray horses wandered the avenues where emperors once paraded in gold. The conquerors moved among the ruins with the cautious reverence of men who realize too late that they have stepped into legend. The air carried a new sound, the slow, rhythmic sweep of brooms as soldiers began to clear the dead. Even victory, it seemed, required cleaning. At the gate of St. Romanus, where the final breach had gaped, the ground was already being leveled. Ottoman engineers drove stakes into the soil, marking where new fortifications would rise. One of them, a young man barely older than Mehmed himself, paused to pick up a fragment of marble. It was carved with a single Greek word, phos, light. He turned it over in his hand, uncertain what it meant, then slipped it into his pocket as a keepsake. Even in conquest, curiosity survived. In the palace courtyard, the Sultan stood alone. The wind tugged at his cloak. A thin drizzle misted his hair. His officers waited at a respectful distance. Before him lay the empty throne of the Palaiologoi, its crimson cushions torn, the double-headed eagle of Byzantium still embroidered in fading thread. He regarded it for a long time. Then he covered the emblem with his cloak so it would not be trampled and said quietly, "Let it sleep." That simple gesture became a legend. It was said that In that moment, Mehmed ceased to be merely a conqueror and became something rarer, a man who understood that taking the world is easier than inheriting its sorrow. Far across the city, the surviving citizens emerged cautiously from their hiding places. Some carried white cloths, others crosses. A few still searched for loved ones amid the rubble. At Hagia Sophia, now the Sultan's new mosque, an imam recited the first Friday prayer, while a Greek priest, spared by royal command, watched from the shadows. The words were different, but the cadence was the same: praise, supplication, surrender. Two faiths met beneath the same dome, neither truly vanquished. For the scholars of Europe, the fall was like a bell tolling across the continent. In Rome, Venice, Florence, men woke to the news and felt the earth shift under their feet. The last wall of the old world had fallen. The map itself had changed. But from the ashes of that loss came an unexpected light. Refugees from Constantinople carried with them manuscripts, philosophies, and the half-forgotten languages of antiquity. They crossed into Italy with the works of Plato, Ptolemy, and Euclid, wrapped in cloth and memory. Within a generation, those texts would kindle what the world would call the Renaissance. Back in the conquered city, Mehmed walked along the sea walls at dusk. He looked westward, where the setting sun painted the water red. Zaganos Pasha joined him. "The chroniclers already write that the age has turned, Majesty," he said. Mehmed smiled faintly. "An age never knows when it dies," he replied. "Only those born after can name its grave." They stood watching the waves strike the broken stones. The Sultan's gaze drifted upward to the seagulls circling above. "Do you hear them?" he asked. "They sound the same as they did yesterday. The world ends, yet the birds keep singing." That night, torches burned along the harbor, reflected in the calm water like strings of amber beads. Survivors and soldiers alike gathered to bury the dead. No one asked who was Christian or Muslim. All looked the same beneath shrouds of linen. An old Byzantine physician tended both sides, his trembling hands wrapping wounds that war had made equal. "We are all fragments now," he murmured. "History will decide where to fit us." In one of the side chapels of Hagia Sophia, a group of monks huddled around a single surviving manuscript. Its first page read simply, "In the beginning was the Word." They debated whether to hide it or present it to the Sultan's scholars. Finally, the eldest closed the book and said, "Words have their own way of surviving. Let them travel." He blew out the candle. The dark seemed almost gentle. At dawn, Mehmed summoned his architects. He ordered the rebuilding of aqueducts, baths, markets, the skeleton of a living city. "Let her breathe again," he told them. "If we rebuild her, the world will remember not only that we conquered, but that we created." His engineers nodded, measuring stones, while smoke still rose from the ruins. Empires, it seemed, could be laid out like blueprints even as the past smoldered at their feet. Across the narrow strait, traders watched in awe. They saw the crescent banners fluttering over the walls and understood that the roots of commerce, faith, and power had changed forever. The road to India, the path to spice and silk, the dreams of explorers, each would bend around this moment. In a few decades, ships bearing Portuguese flags would sail west, seeking what had been lost east of Byzantium. Columbus would call the New World his other Indies, but its first spark had been lit here, in the smoke of Constantinople. For those who lived through it, none of this mattered yet. They knew only that the sky looked different. In the neighborhood spared from fire, children played again among fallen stones, using shields as sleds, cannonballs as seats. Their laughter startled the silence. Life, stubborn as ever, began to reassert itself. In the quiet of his study, Mehmed opened a diary begun years before. His handwriting was precise, almost delicate. On the last page he wrote, "This morning I entered Constantinople. I found a city of marble and dust. I have taken its crown, but not its spirit. If I rule wisely, may God allow both to live." He closed the book and sealed it with wax. History would open it centuries later, still smelling faintly of smoke and salt. That evening, the muezzin's call rose again from Hagia Sophia, joined by the faraway echo of church bells from Galata across the water. Two voices, two faiths, harmonizing by accident. The city's wounds would heal unevenly, its memories never align, yet the sound lingered, a reminder that endings and beginnings often sing the same tune. And beyond the city, the ripples spread. In Florence, painters began to chase light with new obsession, believing it a divine language. In Mainz, a printer named Gutenberg tightened the screws of his press, dreaming of words that could cross oceans. In England, scholars turned again to the Greeks, whispering that knowledge long buried in the East had returned. The fall of Constantinople had shattered the old world's shell, and from its cracks the modern one began to breathe. On the anniversary of the siege, Mehmed returned to the walls. The grass had begun to grow between the stones. He stood where the basilica cannon once roared and said to his attendants, "Remember this place. When men speak of glory, show them this dust." He bent, picked up a small piece of rubble, and let it crumble between his fingers. "Everything ends," he said, "but nothing is wasted." The wind from the sea carried his words inland across valleys and kingdoms until they became something larger than command, a whisper through history. It passed over Europe, over ships yet to be built, over pens yet to write, over hearts yet to dream. That whisper would outlive both conqueror and conquered. For though the walls of Constantinople had fallen, the idea behind them of beauty, knowledge, faith, and endurance did not. It merely changed its language, its shape, its home. The torches that once burned upon those battlements reappeared in workshops, libraries, and studios across a waking world. And so, as night descended once more upon the city, the Bosphorus reflected two lights, the new lamps of an empire rising, and the faint, eternal glow of the one that had gone before. Together, they shimmered upon the water like twin stars. The Middle Ages had ended. Humanity, uncertain but unbroken, turned the page,